I never thought I'd see the day when a simple trip to the gas station would change my life forever. Ava Matthews, standing at the pump, wiping the rain off her jacket, had no idea how much the next few minutes would test her patience and her courage. It was a normal Tuesday, the kind of dreary, overcast day that made everyone just want to go home and curl up with a good book. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and rain-soaked asphalt. She didn't expect anything unusual. Not until Officer John Miller approached. The officer's footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and filled with a sense of entitlement, the kind of entitlement that only comes from power. Ava didn't notice him at first, too focused on the rain, too focused on the droplets running down her windshield. But she felt it, the moment his presence settled beside her, the weight of his gaze making her stomach tighten. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice deep, authoritative but cold. Ava didn't respond immediately. She had dealt with enough rude customers and disrespectful people in her life to know when to pick her battles. But this was different. "I need you to move your car," he said, his tone escalating just a bit, as if she had somehow offended him by not reacting immediately. Ava slowly turned, her eyes meeting his, and she took a deep breath. She wasn't going to be bullied, not by him, not by anyone. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm not blocking anyone," she said calmly, keeping her voice steady. "Just filling up." She could feel his gaze narrow, the arrogance in his eyes unmistakable. His lips curled slightly, like he was deciding whether to make an issue out of nothing. Then, without warning, he stepped forward, his hand extending, the force of his palm connecting with her shoulder, pushing her back. Ava's heart raced, her body tensed, but she refused to step back. She stood her ground, holding his gaze. "Don't touch me," she said, the words soft but firm. "Get off my car." For a moment, everything froze. The noise around them, the soft hum of the pumps, the distant chatter of others, died away. It was just her and him, locked in that instant. Ava felt a flash of heat rise to her cheeks, but it wasn't anger. It was a quiet determination. She wasn't scared. Not anymore. Not after everything she had been through. The officer didn't seem to know how to react at first, his grip lingering on the side of the car. Then, with a huff of frustration, he withdrew, taking a step back. "You're not worth the trouble," he muttered, turning on his heel and striding away. But Ava wasn't done. She reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, a chill running through her as she realized what she was about to do. But she had no choice. If there was one thing she had learned growing up in the tough streets of Brooklyn, it was that sometimes you needed a bigger force to fight the battles you couldn't win on your own. She tapped the contact she needed. Her brother. The one person who had always had her back, no matter what. Samuel Matthews, the U.S. Attorney General. "Hey, Sam." Ava's voice was steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I need you to do something for me. There's a cop here at the gas station, and I think he's about to make a huge mistake." She paused, her mind racing as she glanced back at Officer Miller, still at the corner of her eye, walking away with a smug expression that told her he thought he'd won. "I need you to handle this." The line was silent for a second before her brother's voice came through, calm and deliberate. "Stay right where you are. I'm on my way." Ava hung up the phone, her eyes locked on the officer. She didn't know what was coming next, but she was ready. This time, it wasn't just her against him. This time, she had the law on her side. As Ava stood there, her phone still warm from the call with Samuel, the realization of what she had just done started to settle in. She was not used to calling in favors. She had learned long ago to handle things on her own, to face every challenge with a quiet determination. But this situation was different. This officer, with his arrogance and his power, had crossed a line. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had been silenced by someone in authority. Ava took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the phone in her hand. She could feel the weight of her brother's words still echoing in her mind. "I'm on my way." That was all he had said. But to Ava, those words were more than enough. It wasn't just the words. It was the promise behind them. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't going to let this go. She glanced up just in time to see Officer Miller turn back toward her. His expression was unreadable now, his earlier smugness replaced by something colder, something more calculating. He took a step toward her, as if testing the waters. Ava stood her ground, refusing to back down. She knew what was coming next. She had seen it before, The way people like him believed they could get away with anything because they wore a badge. But this time he was wrong. This time, she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. "What's the problem, officer?" Ava asked, her voice steady, unwavering. Officer Miller stopped just a few feet away from her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't like being disrespected," he said, his tone low, almost threatening. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't show any sign of fear. She had faced worse than this. She had lived through worse. "I wasn't disrespecting you," she said calmly. "I was simply standing my ground." The officer seemed to consider her words for a moment, his jaw clenched tightly. Ava knew he was trying to figure out how to handle this, how to put her in her place without looking like a fool in front of the other people at the gas station. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke again. "You know, I could make this a lot harder for you," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of threat. Ava's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she took a slow step back, her gaze still locked on his. "You could," she said, her voice unwavering. "But you won't." There was a brief moment of silence. Then, just as Ava thought the situation would escalate again, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down, the name on the screen making her breath catch in her throat. "Samuel." She quickly answered, her voice steady. As she spoke into the phone, "It's done, Ava," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "Stay right where you are. I've already made the call. Help is on the way." Ava's heart skipped a beat. The weight of his words settled into her chest, and for the first time since this whole ordeal started, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As she stood there, her phone still pressed to her ear, Officer Miller was watching her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. He clearly didn't understand what was happening, why she was suddenly so calm. Ava could see it in his eyes. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't the same woman he had pushed around earlier. This wasn't just some gas station worker he could belittle. This was someone who had power, someone who had a voice that could reach places he would never be able to touch. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Ava didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The truth was, she didn't owe him any explanations. Not anymore. Instead, she simply met his gaze, her eyes steady and full of quiet confidence. She was waiting for the moment when the truth would hit him, when he would realize that this wasn't just a confrontation at a gas station. This was a lesson in respect, a lesson in power, a lesson in justice. As she stood there, the rain falling softly around her, she knew that this moment would be the beginning of something bigger, something that would change everything. Samuel had always told her that the fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. And now, standing on the wet pavement, Ava Matthews was about to make sure that Officer Miller would never forget the lesson he was about to learn. Ava stood motionless, still holding the phone to her ear as Officer Miller's expression twisted from confusion to apprehension. The words Samuel had spoken, "I've already made the call. Help is on the way," echoed in her mind. It was a promise that she could now feel in her bones. This moment, this confrontation, was about to take a turn that Miller could never have anticipated. He seemed to be weighing his options, looking at Ava as though he could still intimidate her. His posture had shifted slightly, a small crack in the armor of his arrogance. For the first time since their interaction began, he looked uncertain. Ava's gaze remained steady, unwavering. Her heart was calm now, a stark contrast to the storm she'd felt earlier when the officer had first approached her. It was as though the whole world had quieted around them, leaving only this moment in which everything would change. The air was heavy with tension, the rain continuing to drizzle lightly, soaking her coat. Miller's eyes flicked to the side, as if expecting someone to walk up and tell him he had the upper hand. But no one came. The rain pattered softly against the pavement as the minutes stretched on. Ava could feel the silence hanging in the air, thick and uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how much power a single word can hold. "What did you say?" Officer Miller finally asked, breaking the stillness. His voice was no longer as firm as it had been, now tinged with suspicion. Ava's eyes never left his. "I said I've got this handled," she replied calmly, her words clear and unhurried. She didn't need to explain. Not to him. Not anymore. She could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was starting to realize that this wasn't just some routine stop. that the woman standing before him wasn't some powerless gas station worker who could be pushed around. No, Ava Matthews was someone with a powerful family, someone with the connections and resources to call in a favor that could change everything. The weight of her brother's position as the U.S. Attorney General was beginning to dawn on Officer Miller. For the first time, Ava saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He took a step back, glancing around, as if looking for any sign that he could still salvage the situation. But there was no one coming to his aid. No one would step in to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Ava could see it in his face now, the realization that this wasn't something he could sweep under the rug. Not this time. The silence stretched on for another moment before Ava spoke again. "You have no idea what you're messing with, do you?" she asked, her voice smooth but cutting. Miller's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. Ava felt a surge of power, not from anger, but from the calm certainty that justice was on its way. "I think it's time you let me go about my day," she continued, her words not asking, but commanding. For a split second, Ava saw Miller hesitate, his gaze darting to the ground before snapping back to her. Then, with a stiff nod, he turned on his heel and walked away. No words, no apologies, just the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Ava stood there, the weight of the moment settling over her like a blanket. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline that came with the realization that she had just stood up to a man who thought he could do anything, just because of his badge. But this wasn't about Ava. This was about making sure that people like Officer Miller couldn't get away with the things they did. This was about showing that power, no matter how much of it you had, couldn't protect you from the truth. She watched him walk away, the rain lightly soaking his uniform as he headed back toward his squad car. She didn't feel victorious, but she felt something deeper, something stronger. She had stood up for what was right, and she knew that was all that mattered. As she walked toward her car, the phone still in her hand, she felt a shift. A sense of empowerment settled over her. Samuel was right. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. And this moment, was just the beginning. Ava sat in her car, her hands still gripping the steering wheel as the rain continued to fall around her. The events of the last few minutes replayed in her mind like a film on loop. The way Officer Miller had stood there, confused and uncertain, the way he had walked away without saying another word. She had won, without a single punch being thrown, without raising her voice. It wasn't just about that one moment, though. It was about everything that had led to it. Ava thought back to her childhood. In Brooklyn, where she had learned to navigate a world that wasn't always kind to people like her. Growing up, she had seen it all: disrespect, prejudice, and inequality. But she had also seen the power of standing tall, of refusing to be silenced, of fighting for what was right. She had learned that sometimes the greatest weapon was your voice. And sometimes the people you least expected would come through for you when you needed them most. Samuel had always been her protector. When their parents had passed, Samuel, only a few years older, had stepped up in ways no one could have expected. He had taken care of her, not just as her older brother, but as someone who knew how to fight for justice. Ava smiled slightly as she thought of him, her rock, the man who had worked tirelessly to get to where he was now, the U.S. Attorney General. It was his promise to always have her back that had kept her going, even in the toughest times. She could already hear his voice in her head. "Don't let anyone push you around. You know who you are." Ava had always lived by those words, but today they felt heavier than ever. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for every person who had ever been underestimated, who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever been told they were not enough. The sound of her phone vibrating on the passenger seat interrupted her thoughts. It was Samuel. She answered quickly. "Hey, Ava." His voice was calm, but she could hear the urgency behind it. "You did good back there. I just got off the phone with the police department. They're handling the situation." Ava let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thanks, Sam," she replied softly. "I'm just glad it's over." Samuel paused, and she could almost hear him smiling. "It's never really over, sis. You know that. But today, you showed them something important." Ava's grip on the wheel tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. "I didn't want to cause a scene," she said, her voice quiet. "But I knew I couldn't just let him walk away without facing the consequences." "That's what I'm talking about," Samuel replied. Sometimes it takes someone with the courage to speak up. You did that, and you didn't back down. Ava's mind drifted back to Officer Miller, the way he had initially tried to intimidate her, to make her feel small, to make her doubt herself. She had almost given in to that pressure, but something inside her had snapped. She had realized that it wasn't just about him or his badge. It was about her, her dignity, and her right to be treated fairly. She wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. I didn't back down, Ava repeated, more to herself than to her brother. And I won't. That's my girl, Samuel said with pride in his voice. Remember, Ava, you've got the power to make a difference. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been silenced. Ava smiled, the weight of his words settling deep within her. She knew this was just the beginning. She had taken a stand today, and she had made sure that Officer Miller knew there were consequences for his actions. But this fight wasn't just about one man. It was about the system, about making sure people like him never got away with abusing their power. It was about creating a world where no one had to live in fear of being mistreated, a world where respect and fairness were the rule, not the exception. As Ava put the car in drive and pulled away from the gas station, she felt a sense of purpose filling her chest. The road ahead would not be easy, she knew that. But she was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. She had already proven that to herself today. Ava's thoughts raced as she drove through the rainy streets, the world outside a blur of gray and wet pavement. The tension from earlier had started to wear off, but a quiet, simmering determination remained. She was still processing everything that had happened at the gas station, but now, with each passing block, she felt the weight of what she had done settling in. It wasn't just about standing up to Officer Miller. It was about the bigger picture, about something that had been building for years, the need for change, the need for justice, the need for respect. Ava's phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced down briefly, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Samuel's name flashing on the screen. She picked up immediately. Ava, Samuel's voice came through, calm yet serious. I just spoke with the department. They're moving forward with an internal review of Miller's conduct. You did the right thing today. It's not over yet, but they're taking it seriously. Ava exhaled slowly, the tightness in her chest loosening a bit. Thank you, she whispered, her voice soft. She knew Samuel's words meant more than just legal backing. They meant that someone who had the power to make things happen was on her side. It was a feeling she didn't take lightly. Don't thank me yet, Samuel replied. This is only the beginning. I need you to stay strong. The pressure's going to ramp up. We both know how this works. Ava nodded to herself, even though her brother couldn't see her. I know, she said firmly. But I'm not backing down. Good. Because the system will try to make this go away. You'll have to stay loud, Ava. Keep pushing. People like Miller, they think they can get away with it because they're used to silence. But not anymore. Ava's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Samuel was right. Silence was what allowed people like Officer Miller to operate without fear of consequences. But Ava wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't going to be silent. She didn't care how loud she had to be. The world had to hear this story. The truth had to come out. I won't be silent, Ava said with conviction, her voice firm and unwavering. Good. And remember, I've got your back. Always. Ava smiled, the reassurance from her brother settling her nerves. I know. I'm just tired of it, Sam. Tired of always having to fight for respect, for fairness, for being seen. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Samuel spoke again, his voice softer now. I know, sis. I know. Ava felt a lump form in her throat as she kept driving, but she blinked it away. She wasn't going to let this moment weaken her. She had work to do. She had a battle to fight. I'm doing this for everyone who can't, Ava continued, her voice steady once more. Everyone who's been silenced, who's been stepped on, who's been treated like they don't matter. I'm not just doing this for me. Exactly, Samuel replied. And you'll make them listen. Ava glanced at the road ahead, a quiet resolve in her chest. She wasn't alone in this fight. Samuel was right. This was bigger than her, bigger than one officer's actions. This was a fight for everyone who had ever been dismissed or pushed aside because of who they were, where they came from, or what they looked like. She had spent years watching injustice unfold around her, and now, it was her turn to make sure things changed. She wouldn't be the one who stayed silent, who let people like Miller keep doing whatever they wanted. No, she was going to make sure the world saw the truth. The rain picked up, drumming against the roof of her car as Ava's thoughts steadied. She could feel the shift, the movement of something larger than herself, something that could, and would, create real change. And she was going to be right there at the front, making sure the world knew what was at stake. The injustice would not stand. Not anymore. As she turned the corner toward her apartment, Ava could already feel the weight of the coming days. The investigation, the pressure, the scrutiny. It was all coming. But she was ready. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Ava sat on the edge of her bed, her phone still in her hand, the faint glow from the screen casting shadows across the room. She had just finished another conversation with Samuel, and the reality of what was coming started to sink in. She knew this was far from over. The pressure, the scrutiny, it was all about to intensify. She had expected the department to act quickly, but this was more than just one man's misconduct. This was a system that needed to be challenged, and Ava knew that she would have to be the one to face it head-on. Her apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that felt thick with expectation. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a constant reminder of the small, simple things that made up her life. But now things had changed. Her life was no longer simple. She had become part of something bigger, something that had the power to shift the balance of power. Ava couldn't help but think back to the gas station. The way she had stood her ground, refusing to back down when Officer Miller had tried to assert his dominance. She had expected him to argue, to escalate the situation. But instead, he had walked away, leaving her standing there, victorious. She had felt something shift inside her that day, a realization that she had the ability to change things, to make her voice heard. And that feeling had stayed with her, growing stronger as the days went on. But now, she was facing a new challenge. She couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. She had made her stand, but that was only the beginning. The investigation was just starting, and the road ahead was going to be long and difficult. She had seen how quickly things could spiral out of control, how easy it was for people to dismiss the truth when it didn't suit their agenda. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had been through a lot in her life. Loss, betrayal, struggle. But this was different. This was the fight she had been preparing for without even realizing it. She wasn't going to let anyone silence her. Not anymore. The phone buzzed again, this time a text from Samuel. The department's already starting to get heat. They'll try to downplay this. Don't let them. Ava read the message and let out a slow breath. She had known this was coming. The powers that be were already starting to protect their own. She couldn't afford to back down now. She had to be louder than ever. She had to make sure that Officer Miller wasn't just a blip on the radar, that his actions didn't get swept under the rug like so many before him. This was bigger than him. This was about making sure that the system didn't continue to operate unchecked. She couldn't do this alone, but she knew she didn't have to. Samuel was right. The pressure was only going to get worse. But she had already made the hardest decision. She had stepped up. She had raised her voice. And now, she was going to make sure everyone heard her. Ava tossed her phone aside and stood up, pacing the room for a moment. She had to stay focused. She had to keep her head clear. The fight ahead was going to be a marathon, not a sprint, and she couldn't afford to burn out too soon. She thought back to her childhood, to the lessons her mother had taught her about perseverance. She had always told Ava that strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about the will to keep going, even when things seemed impossible. Ava smiled to herself, remembering her mother's words. It was a lesson she had carried with her whole life. And now, she was going to apply it in the biggest fight of her life. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let them win. Ava walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the lights of the passing cars. The world was moving on, just as it always did. But for Ava, the world had changed. She had taken the first step towards something bigger than herself, and she knew it wasn't going to be easy. But she was ready. She had to be. The fight for justice wasn't going to be won in a day, but she was going to make sure it started with her. Ava woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. It was still dark outside, the early morning light barely breaking through the blinds. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of the coming day. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes as she reached for the phone. The screen lit up, showing Samuel's name. She answered quickly. Ava. Samuel's voice came through, steady but urgent. I just got a call from the department. Miller's been placed on administrative leave. This is moving faster than we expected. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She had known the wheels would start turning, but hearing it from Samuel made it all feel real. The investigation was no longer just a distant possibility. It was happening. That's good, right? Ava asked, trying to steady her voice. It is, Samuel confirmed. But don't get complacent. This is just the beginning. They'll try to delay, make it disappear. You have to stay on top of this. Ava exhaled slowly. She had always known that the path to justice wasn't smooth, but hearing the urgency in Samuel's voice reminded her of how high the stakes were. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been ignored, belittled, or silenced by a system that had too long turned a blind eye. I won't let them forget, she said, her voice firm. Good, Samuel said, and she could almost hear the approval in his tone. I know you won't. Keep pushing. The world's watching. Ava hung up the phone and sat still for a moment. The weight of the situation was settling in, but so was the strength she had felt from the moment she had stepped up to Officer Miller. She was ready. She had to be. Today was going to be a long day, and it wasn't going to be easy. But Ava wasn't afraid. As she got out of bed and pulled on a pair of jeans, she thought back to the first time she had stood up for herself. It had been years ago, back in high school, when she had first learned that silence was never the answer. She remembered the small victories she had won, the moments when speaking out had made a difference. But this was bigger. This was about making sure that the system didn't silence her or anyone else ever again. Ava stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She had always been strong, but today, there was something different about her. A quiet confidence, a strength that came from knowing she was doing the right thing. You've got this, she whispered to herself, nodding to her reflection. She was ready. Ava grabbed her bag, checking her phone one last time for any updates. There was a message from Samuel. I'll meet you at the courthouse. Be careful today. She slipped her phone into her bag and stepped out of the apartment. The city was still waking up, the streets relatively quiet, the usual bustle not yet in full swing. She walked briskly, her footsteps steady, her mind focused. The courthouse wasn't far, and she knew this was where the next battle would take place. She had made it this far, but it wasn't over. Not yet. As she neared the courthouse, she could see the media already gathering outside, their cameras trained on the entrance. Ava took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment when she would have to face the world, when her story would no longer just be hers. It would belong to everyone who had ever felt powerless. She walked into the building with her head held high, the weight of her decision weighing heavily on her, but the fire of determination burning brighter than ever. As she passed through security and made her way to the courtroom, she could feel the eyes of others on her. The media, the staff, even the people in the courthouse, they were all watching. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was the one who was speaking out, the one who was holding people accountable. Ava found Samuel in the hallway, waiting for her with a reassuring smile. You ready? He asked, his voice calm. Ava nodded, her nerves steadying as she looked at her brother. Let's do this. Together, they entered the courtroom. Ava's footsteps echoed in the empty space, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the world had stopped. She took a seat at the table, facing the judge, the prosecutor, and the defense team. The weight of the moment hit her, but she wasn't afraid. She had come this far. She wasn't turning back now. As the proceedings began, Ava knew that the real battle was just starting. But she was ready. She would see this through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or silenced. She would make them listen, and she would make sure that justice was finally served. Ava felt the tension rise as she sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, everything felt more real, more intense. The room was filled with people, lawyers, reporters, and a handful of onlookers, all focused on the proceedings. Ava's heart beat a little faster as the judge entered, the room falling silent in an instant. As the judge took his seat and the court was called to order, Ava's thoughts drifted to everything that had led up to this moment. The gas station, Officer Miller's arrogant stance, her phone call with Samuel, the fight that had started small but was now growing into something much bigger. She knew that today wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been wronged by the system, every person who had suffered silently. The thought of all those people kept her grounded. She couldn't back down now. Samuel sat beside her, his presence calming, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. He was here for her, just as he had always been, and he had made it clear that this wasn't just a case. It was a statement that injustice, no matter how small it seemed, could not be ignored. As the prosecutor began speaking, Ava tuned in to the details of the case. She hadn't expected it to move quickly, but hearing the details of what had happened to Officer Miller, how the department was responding, it made her feel like things were finally heading in the right direction. She listened carefully, absorbing every word. Samuel's advice echoed in her mind. Stay focused. Let them see your strength. The defense attorney stood up next, a sharp contrast to the prosecutor's approach. He was confident, almost smug, as he began his argument. He tried to discredit Ava's version of the events, painting her as an exaggerator, someone who had misinterpreted the situation. Ava sat straighter in her chair, her eyes fixed on the defense attorney, and something inside her shifted. She had prepared for this. She had known they would try to twist the narrative, try to make her look like the one in the wrong. But it didn't matter. She knew the truth. And that truth, she realized in that moment, was her most powerful weapon. When the defense attorney finished speaking, it was Ava's turn to take the stand. She took a deep breath and stood, walking slowly toward the witness stand. The room was still, the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She had always known that speaking her truth wouldn't be easy, but today, it felt different. It felt like the moment when everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, was going to come to a head. As she took her seat on the stand, she locked eyes with the judge. "Tell us what happened that day," the prosecutor said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of urgency in it. Ava's mind flashed back to the gas station. She could almost feel the rain on her face again, the way Officer Miller had stepped too close, the way he had tried to bully her into submission. "I was at the gas station, just trying to get some fuel," Ava began, her voice calm but unwavering. "Officer Miller approached me and asked me to move my car. I explained that I wasn't blocking anyone, but he didn't listen. He got closer, and his tone changed. He became aggressive." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in. "I tried to stay calm, but he shoved me. Not in a way that could be misunderstood. He physically pushed me. And when I asked him to stop, he didn't. He just kept trying to intimidate me." Ava could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to back down now. "When I realized that he wasn't going to listen, I called my brother. He's the U.S. Attorney General. I told him what happened, and he told me to stay calm. And I did. I stayed calm, and I stood my ground." There was a quiet pause in the room, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. Ava could feel the weight of the moment, the shift in the air as everyone processed her words. The defense attorney stood up quickly, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. She can't speak for her brother." The judge held up a hand. "Sustained. Please stick to the facts, Miss Matthews." Ava nodded, her face a mask of calm, but inside, she felt a small wave of relief. She wasn't going to let them distract her. She wasn't going to let them make her second-guess herself. "I called my brother," she continued, her voice steady. "But that's not the point. The point is, Officer Miller had no right to treat me that way. No right to use his position to intimidate me, to make me feel like I wasn't worth listening to." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "And when I stood up for myself, he walked away. He thought I was going to be afraid. But I wasn't." Ava's heart raced in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had said everything she needed to say. She wasn't afraid anymore. The defense attorney didn't have anything to say after that. The room was still, and for the first time, Ava felt like she was truly in control. The rest of the trial seemed to blur together after that, the details fading into the background as Ava's mind stayed focused on the one thing that mattered: the truth. The truth she had shared, the truth she had stood up for. And as the trial continued, Ava knew one thing for sure: she wasn't done yet. The fight was far from over, but she had made her mark. And no matter what came next, she was ready. Ava stood outside the courthouse, the cold wind tugging at her jacket as she stared out at the crowd that had gathered. The media, the onlookers, the reporters with their cameras trained on the building. It was a far cry from the quiet life she had once known. The weight of everything she had just gone through pressed on her chest, but she wasn't overwhelmed. Not anymore. She had come this far. And as the door behind her opened, Samuel stepped out, his face serious, but with that reassuring smile she had come to rely on. "How did it go?" Ava asked, her voice low but steady. "We're moving in the right direction," Samuel replied, his tone guarded. "The judge seemed to lean in your favor. But there's still a lot to be done. You have to be ready for the next phase." Ava nodded, her hands folded across her chest as she looked up at her brother. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. "I won't back down." Samuel studied her for a moment, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know you won't. But don't let them wear you down. The pressure's going to keep building." Ava took a deep breath, taking in the scene before her. The world around her was still moving, the crowd buzzing with speculation and anticipation. She knew that for every person who believed in what she was doing, there would be just as many trying to tear her down, trying to make her doubt herself. But Ava had long learned that her strength didn't come from others' approval. It came from within. It came from knowing who she was and what she stood for. "I won't let them win," she said, more to herself than to Samuel. "Good," Samuel said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "Because this fight isn't just for you. It's for everyone who's ever been pushed aside." Ava's gaze shifted toward the doors of the courthouse again, her mind racing through the events that had led up to this moment. She had stepped into the ring, and now there was no turning back. The system had tried to silence her, but she had found her voice. She had found her strength. And now, no matter how hard they tried, they would never be able to take that from her. "I'm doing this for everyone," Ava said, her voice a quiet resolve. "For all the people who've been told they're not enough. For the ones who've been dismissed, ignored. For the ones who don't have a voice, I'll be their voice." Samuel gave her a long look before speaking again, his voice low. "You've got the heart for this, Ava. But the world doesn't always play fair. It's going to get harder before it gets better." Ava met his gaze, her eyes steady and filled with determination. "I'm not backing down," she said again. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she realized how true those words were. She was standing on the precipice of something bigger than herself, something that could change everything. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had already faced down her fears. She had already stood up for what was right. She was doing it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed down by the system. She turned away from Samuel, her steps purposeful as she began to walk toward the street. The sounds of the crowd faded behind her, the weight of their gazes no longer heavy. She wasn't just a bystander in this story anymore. She was the one writing it. She was the one taking control. And as she walked out into the cool air of the city, she felt the first flickers of something inside her. A spark, a fire, an unshakable resolve that no one could extinguish. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But Ava was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't afraid of the world or the people who tried to silence her. She had found her voice. And now, nothing could stop her. Ava stood in front of the courthouse, the crowd slowly dissipating as the day wore on. The weight of what had just transpired in the courtroom still lingered in her chest, but there was something else there now. A quiet strength, a sense of purpose that had grown in her with every step she had taken in this fight. The pressure was still building, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like something she could handle. Samuel had been right. The fight wasn't over, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, Ava felt like she could see the path ahead. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for something bigger, something that would change the world for people like her. As she walked down the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw that it was another message from Samuel. "They're already preparing their defense. They're going to try to discredit everything you've said. Be prepared." Ava felt a sharp pang of frustration, but she pushed it aside. She had expected this. The system was designed to protect its own, to make sure that people like her didn't get in the way of that. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She had made her stand, and she wasn't going to back down now. She typed a quick reply, her fingers steady on the screen. "I'm ready. We're not stopping." As she hit send, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let them silence her. Not now, not ever. Ava continued down the steps, her gaze focused ahead, her mind running through the next steps. The trial was far from over, but she knew that every moment, Every piece of evidence, every word spoken in that courtroom, was moving them closer to the truth. And the truth would not be denied. As she reached the bottom of the steps, she heard a voice behind her. Ava. She turned and saw one of the reporters she had seen earlier running toward her. Do you have a moment for a quick statement? The reporter asked, holding up a microphone. Ava hesitated for a moment, then nodded. This was her chance to make her voice heard again, to make sure that everyone knew what this was really about. Sure, she said, stepping forward. The reporter adjusted the microphone and began asking questions. Ava, how do you feel about the progress of the case so far? He asked. Ava took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment. I feel like we're heading in the right direction, she said, her voice calm but firm. But this is just the beginning. This fight is about more than just one man or one incident. It's about making sure that no one is ever treated like I was. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult it may be. The reporter nodded, clearly impressed. And what's your message to those who might be watching this, who might be going through something similar? Ava smiled, a quiet confidence in her eyes. Don't stay silent. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't matter. Stand up for yourself, for what's right. It's not easy, but it's worth it. And you're not alone. The reporter thanked her, and Ava walked away, her heart pounding with the weight of her own words. She had just spoken to the world, and she knew that her words would be heard. As she walked toward her car, she realized something. The fight had already begun to change her. She wasn't just the woman who had been pushed around by Officer Miller anymore. She was the woman who was changing the system. She was the one who was making sure that people like her would never be silenced again. And that, she knew, was worth everything. As she got into the car and started driving, her thoughts turned to the future. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But Ava was ready. She had already proven that she could stand tall, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And now, she was going to make sure that her voice was heard, no matter what. Ava sat in her car, parked a few blocks away from the courthouse, her mind still racing from the day's events. The trial had taken another turn, and although she felt proud of how far they had come, the weight of the situation was starting to settle heavily on her shoulders. She had never expected things to move so quickly, but now, with each passing day, it was becoming more apparent that the world was watching. The case was no longer just about her. It was about making a statement, about proving that people who were silenced, ignored, or pushed down had the power to fight back. Ava had known it wouldn't be easy, but the scrutiny was starting to take its toll. She had been interviewed by the media, asked questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. She had heard the whispers, the judgments, the assumptions people made about her. But the thing that kept her grounded was the truth. The truth she had fought for. The truth that had brought her here. Ava looked down at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had received several messages, mostly from Samuel, updates on the case, and words of encouragement. But there was one message that stood out. It was from a reporter who had covered the story. Ava, can we get a comment for the evening news? Your story is gaining traction, but we need more from you. Ava stared at the message for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She had been careful about what she shared with the media. She didn't want to appear too rehearsed, too polished. She needed to speak from the heart, to make sure her words carried the weight of everything she had been through. With a deep breath, Ava typed a quick reply. I'll be at the press conference in 30 minutes. She set the phone down and turned off the engine, her heart pounding with anticipation. This was another moment where she would have to stand up and speak out, to continue pushing for justice. She wasn't sure what would come of it, but she knew it was time. Time to take control of the narrative. Ava arrived at the press conference, the flashing cameras and the crowd of reporters reminding her of just how much was at stake. She walked to the front, her head held high, her mind focused. She had spoken the truth, but this time, she would have to do it in front of the entire world. The room quieted as Ava took the microphone. Thank you all for being here, she began, her voice steady but full of resolve. I know that many of you have been following this case, and I appreciate the attention it's getting. But I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about me. This is about the millions of people who feel like their voices don't matter. The people who have been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by a system that was never built to serve them. I'm standing here today not just for myself, but for all of them. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. I've lived my entire life fighting to be seen, to be heard. But no one should have to fight for their own dignity. No one should have to prove that they matter. Ava's heart raced as she looked out at the sea of reporters, their pens and microphones aimed at her. She could feel their gaze, the weight of their expectations, but she didn't let it break her focus. Officer Miller and the actions he took that day were wrong, Ava continued. But what's more important is that the system that allowed him to act that way needs to change. We need accountability. We need a system that works for everyone, not just for those who are in power. She could hear the murmurs of agreement from the crowd, but she didn't stop. This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture that has allowed inequality to persist. And I won't stop until I see that change. I will not back down. Ava's words were clear, powerful, and unwavering. She felt the truth in every syllable she spoke. This wasn't just her fight. It was the fight of so many others who had been silenced for too long. And she was ready to lead the charge. As the press conference wrapped up, Ava walked away from the podium, her head still held high. She had said what needed to be said, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but she knew that every step she took, every word she spoke, was bringing them closer to justice. She wasn't doing this for the recognition. She wasn't doing it for the applause. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. And she wasn't going to stop until the world knew that. Ava walked through the crowd, the flashing cameras no longer intimidating, the voices of reporters no longer overwhelming. She had a purpose, and nothing was going to stop her from achieving it. Not the media, not the system, not the people who tried to silence her. She was ready for whatever came next. The fight for justice was only just beginning, and she was ready to see it through. Ava sat quietly in her office, staring out the window at the city below. The trial was over, but the battle was far from finished. She could still feel the weight of everything she had fought for, the pressure of the case weighing heavily on her mind. The world had watched her take a stand, but now, as the dust began to settle, she realized that the real work was just beginning. The media coverage had been intense, the eyes of the public on her every move. She had known that speaking out would bring attention, but the scrutiny had grown more intense than she had anticipated. She had received calls from all corners, supporters, critics, and everyone in between. But despite the whirlwind of activity, Ava felt a sense of calm in the midst of it all. She had done what she set out to do. She had spoken her truth. She had made sure her voice was heard. And now, the world knew who she was. But what did that mean for the future? What did it mean for the millions of others who felt as she had? Ava leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. She thought back to the day at the gas station when everything had started. It had seemed so small then, just a single moment in time. But in that moment, she had made a choice. She had chosen to stand up. And standing up had changed everything. Ava had no illusions about the road ahead. She knew the system wasn't going to change overnight. She knew there would be resistance, and she knew it would take time. But she also knew that change was possible. It was happening, slowly but surely. She had seen it in the way people reacted to her story. She had seen it in the way her words had inspired others to speak out, to demand justice. She wasn't the only one fighting anymore. She wasn't alone. The phone rang, pulling Ava from her thoughts. She picked it up and answered, recognizing the voice on the other end immediately. "Ava, it's Samuel." His voice was calm, but there was an urgency in it that she recognized. "I just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" Ava smiled to herself. "I'm good, Sam," she said, her voice steady. "Just thinking about everything. The case is over, but it feels like it's only just beginning." "I know," Samuel replied. "The fight doesn't end with the trial. It's just the beginning of a much bigger battle. But I'm proud of what you've done, Ava. You've shown the world that one person can make a difference." Ava felt a warmth spread through her at her brother's words. "Thanks, Sam," she said softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Samuel's voice softened. "You didn't need me. You've always had the strength to do this on your own. I'm just glad I could be there to support you." Ava leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I guess this is where we start," she said, her tone thoughtful. "The real work. The changes we need to see in the system. It's not going to happen all at once. But it's happening. Slowly." Samuel's voice was steady. "It is. And you're a big part of making that happen, Ava. Your courage is inspiring." Ava's heart swelled with pride. But she also felt something else, something deeper, a sense of responsibility. The world had seen her fight, but now, she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't let this moment be the end of the story. The work was just beginning, and she had to be a part of it. "I'm not done," Ava said firmly. "This is just the start. We've got a lot more to do." Samuel chuckled softly. "I know, and I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." Ava smiled, feeling the warmth of his words. It was a moment of peace in the midst of everything, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. "Thanks, Sam. I appreciate it." As the conversation ended, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. She was fighting for change. And no matter how long it took, no matter how hard the road ahead would be, she was ready. She stood up, walking toward the door. There was still so much work to be done, but Ava knew one thing for sure. She was ready to face whatever came next. The world had seen her strength, and now, she was going to make sure that strength didn't fade. She would continue to stand up. For herself, for others, for the truth. And she would make sure the world would listen. Ava sat at her kitchen table, staring at the pile of papers in front of her. The case was not over, but the storm was beginning to settle. The courtroom had been quiet, but the media frenzy outside had been anything but. Every day had felt like a new battle, the pressure growing with each passing hour. But now, after days of interviews, questions, and constant attention, Ava had finally found a moment of peace. She had made her mark, and the world was watching. She wasn't just Ava Matthews anymore. She was a symbol. She had been waiting for this moment for years, waiting for a chance to make her voice heard, to make a difference. But now that she was here, standing at the forefront of change, she realized that the real work was just beginning. She was no longer just a participant in her own life. She was an agent of change, and that meant responsibility. It wasn't just about winning a case or proving a point. It was about making sure the system would change, about making sure people who had been ignored or mistreated by the system no longer had to suffer in silence. Ava sighed and leaned back in her chair, glancing at the clock on the wall. She had spent the last several weeks juggling the court case, the media, and the ever-growing pressure from her supporters and critics alike. She could feel the weight of it all, but she had also learned something important in the process. She had learned that she was stronger than she realized. She had always known she was strong, but now she understood the depth of that strength. The doorbell rang, pulling Ava from her thoughts. She stood up and walked to the door, wondering who it could be at this hour. She opened it to find Samuel standing on the other side, his face warm with a smile, but there was something else in his eyes, something Ava couldn't quite place. "Hey sis," Samuel said, stepping inside. "How are you holding up?" Ava smiled, her heart lifting at the sight of her brother. "I'm good," she replied. "Tired, but good." Samuel nodded, his expression softening. "I can imagine. But I wanted to come by, check in on you. You've been through a lot these past few weeks." Ava motioned for him to sit at the table, then took a seat herself. "It's been a lot. But we're making progress, Sam. Things are changing." Samuel didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood by the window, his back to Ava as he looked out over the city. The silence between them felt heavy, but Ava didn't break it. She could sense he was thinking about something, his mind working through the complexities of the case and everything that had come with it. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice low. "You know, this isn't just about Officer Miller anymore. It's about something bigger. You've become the face of something that's bigger than all of us. People are looking to you for leadership." Ava blinked, not fully understanding what he meant. "Leadership?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "But I'm just—" "No," Samuel interrupted gently, turning to face her. "You're not just anything. You're the one who stepped up when no one else would. You've become the voice for those who've been ignored. You've shown the world that you won't be silenced. And now, people are going to start looking to you for guidance, for direction. They're going to expect you to keep pushing for change." Ava felt a lump form in her throat. She had always known that standing up for herself meant standing up for others, but hearing Samuel say it out loud made it feel more real, more important. "I never wanted this," Ava said quietly, looking down at her hands. "I never asked for any of this." Samuel sat down across from her, his eyes full of understanding. "I know, but sometimes, Ava, we're called to do things we never expected. You're exactly where you need to be. The change you're pushing for, it's going to take time. But you're doing something no one else has been able to do. You're making a difference. Ava swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. I don't know if I can keep going like this. The pressure, it's a lot. Samuel's hand rested gently on her arm. You can, Ava. Because you're not alone. You've got all of us behind you. And no matter what happens next, you'll never be alone in this fight. Ava nodded, taking in his words. She knew that Samuel was right. The fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been overlooked. It was about making sure their voices were heard too. Thanks, Sam, she said softly. I don't know what I'd do without you. Samuel smiled, his eyes filled with pride. You'll never have to find out. I'm always going to be here. As they sat together in the quiet of the room, Ava realized something. The battle wasn't just in the courtroom. It was out there in the world, in the hearts and minds of the people who needed to hear her story. She wasn't finished yet. There was so much more to do. But she was ready. With her brother by her side, with the support of those who believed in her, she knew she could keep fighting. And no matter what came next, she wouldn't back down.